Gracias, profesora Cortina, por su lúcida intervención y, además, al punto de los 10 minutos. A continuación es el turno del embajador Dayan Yayateka. Es embajador extraordinario y plenipotenciario de Sri Lanka en Francia y también acreditado ante España y Portugal, delegado permanente de Sri Lanka en esta institución, la UNESCO. Estudió ciencias políticas y filosofía y tiene una larga carrera no solo diplomática sino también política en su país. Embajador.
Thank you, Mr. President. Louis Althusser, who dominated the field of radical philosophy here in Paris in the 70s until tragic crime put an end to his philosophizing and his academic life, once said in a celebrated disclaimer, I am only a philosopher. Now, I'm not even a philosopher, speaking for myself. I am only a political scientist. Though I have strayed through the realm of political philosophy back into ethics. I suggest that we look at the topic in terms of its founding categories, its building blocks. You have, on the one hand, humanism and post-humanism. Then you have science and ethics. And these are bracketed. Humanism and post-humanism. Science and ethics. And all related to the overall rubric of the discussion on the new humanism. Now, if I may recall us to some fairly basic propositions about humanism, or that school of thought which holds that man is the measure, a human-centric or humanocentric worldview. It is useful to reflect, to recall us to the bifurcation that took place between man as individual and man as a social and political being. Man alone even in his togetherness, and man together even in his solitude. So we are speaking really of the stress in humanism on liberty, on individual freedom, the Hegelian notion of history being the increasing extension of the realm of freedom, and the recognition or the stress on man as a social and political being, man in his collectivity. This contestation has dominated the philosophical debate of modernity and politics, really, between the liberal democratic and the socialist, communist ideas and ideologies. Now, when we shift to post-humanism, which is not the same as new humanism, we may understand the term post-humanism in one of three senses. One in the sense that David Gimbel intended it yesterday, that is, that man's presence, man's existence has in fact been of relatively short duration and may in fact end. So in that sense we're talking about post-humanism. But it also depends on the stress one places. Is it post-humanism? Are we talking about post-man? Or are we talking about post-humanism in terms of a transcendence of an idea and a school of thought? So, yes, post-humanism in the sense of the end of man. This is one. Post-humanism also in the sense of the transcendence of a philosophy. But there is a third sense which I would wish to draw your attention to. Because humanism, be it the humanism of the earlier centuries or the one which hopefully remains a project that we are working on, new humanism, has to face the challenge that was posed by Nietzsche, for one, when he said man is something that has to be overcome. Now, what did he mean by this? he did not mean, and we must not take it in its vulgar sense, of some sort of genetic experiment. What Nietzsche really meant was that the values by which man lived had caused man to decline in his grandeur from a Homeric past, the past of the Homeric heroes. Nietzsche, as you know, was a little ambivalent on the Socratic moment. And he sought what he called the transvaluation of values to perhaps restore man to a certain heroic grandeur. So, when we discuss post-humanism, we must transcend, we must move beyond the smugness with which we place man as he or she exists as the center of philosophy. We must also think of the limits of man, not only the biological limits that David was talking about, but also the existential limits, the limits in terms of values, the limits in terms of, shall we say, consciousness that Nietzsche was adverting to. And since we are here in Paris, perhaps it is apposite to remember that Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, having met and had a long discussion with Ernesto Che Guevara, chose to call him the most complete man of our age, the age of the 20th century. So in that sense, it was an echo or an answer to Nietzsche's problem of the fall of man and the need for the evolution of a new or restored type of man would combine certain qualities. Nietzsche himself indicated in a very, I would say, a very striking metaphor, the kind of man he was talking about. He said, Caesar with the soul of Christ. So that remains, in a way, a challenge of post-humanism, or perhaps even of a new humanism. Now, if we are to move to science and ethics, I think that I would like to shift the emphasis from the ethical limits or norms of scientific experimentation to the social. What I mean is this. Science is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it has exponentially expanded the possibilities. On the other, it has also exponentially increased the hazards, the dangers, the point that David was making yesterday. And this is where ethics come in. Because the point, I think, is not to place a cap of ethics on the development of science. This is not only wrong, it is ahistorical in terms of the evolution of both ethics and ethics, mathematics, philosophy, politics. All of this were one. If we go back to the Greeks, I think ethics comes in a different sense. Is it possible for us to permit, encourage, enhance the possibilities that science open up, while minimizing, deterring, protecting ourselves and our species against the catastrophes that loom with the unfettered development of science? The point, therefore, is not to place fetters on the scientific mind or on scientific experiment, but to have an economic and a social experiment, because here too all is experimental, that would permit the development of science to benefit humanity, for instance, in the realm of medical research, the fight against cancer and so many preventable and curable diseases, while on the other hand, combating the effects of climate change. Now there we are talking not only of political will, as Professor Kalanji quite rightly pointed out, but of an economic system and a political system. Because what we have today and what we have experienced are anti-humanistic systems, by which I refer to predatory or neoliberal capitalism and statist socialism. We have had the climate changes and the natural disasters, the man-made disasters that both systems have caused. So ethics comes in, ethics and science come in the sense that the challenge is to imagine an order, a social structure, social system, social arrangements, economic arrangements, which are in fact humanistic, which place man and everything that he and she need to sustain themselves, which includes the ecosystem, at the center. There is where we must address our efforts when we think about science and ethics. Now, if I may bring it back to the new humanism and begin to wind up, in what sense must the new humanism be new? I would say that humanism has to be globalized. This is not to decry or deride the breakthroughs made in the West and in the North in the history of human thinking. But we must seek out the contributions to a human-centric world outlook made in other parts of the world and at other times. So, the globalization of humanism, which would be new, may also take us to some of the older roots of humanism. So there would be continuity and change. And since most of the speakers have presented us with many words of wisdom, important thoughts of thinkers past, I would leave you with two. One, which sums up for me the best, most epigrammatic humanist motto, which brings together the well-being of humankind with that of nature. And that is the saying attributed to the Buddha 2,500 years ago, 2,600 years ago, which may or may not derive from the earlier tradition of the Vedas, where he said, "May all living beings be happy." May all living beings be happy. And that is the challenge. Is it possible, as I said, to construct or imagine a social and economic system which would permit all living beings to be happy? And the final thought I would like to share with you, since we've been talking about philosophy, is that sometimes the answers have to be post-philosophical. And I say post-philosophical in the sense that a trained philosopher, Karl Marx, intended when he, as a young man, he made, youngish man, made his critique of another philosopher, Ludwig Feuerbach. And his famous 11th thesis, or his thesis on Feuerbach, which is carved on his tombstone in the Highgate Cemetery in London, said that hitherto philosophers have all interpreted the world. The problem, however, is to change it. Thank you.